So the last time that I did this, it's been I'd say about a week since I've done this. Whenever I talked about relationships, and I thought a lot about that one because that was a really tough one for me to talk about because there's so many factors, so many variables to that topic that it's really hard to figure out just what I wanted to say, and it was even more difficult because I didn't necessarily do as much research as I probably could have. Now, I had a good enough idea on what I wanted to say because I'd already been thinking about it for a long time, but the concepts are really difficult to try and grasp and try and understand just what I wanted to say and how and which direction I wanted to go with how I was saying things. But that was relationships. And so now with this one, I want to really delve deep into the five personality traits, the five personality, big five personality types. Those go so much deeper than what I've gone through so far, and I really just want to get those done with, like fully explain exactly what all of those mean. And I'm going to try and do this to the best of my ability. I've gotten a lot more knowledge with them as well since the last time I've even talked about them. And so I'm going to start off with the most difficult one, or at least the most difficult one to explain that I believe it is, which is going to be neuroticism. So before I start off with all the five traits, so what is the big five personality traits? So they were developed, I believe, in the mid 1900s. I can't remember what the psychologist's name was who originally created them. But I know that they've been around for a decent amount of time. Not a huge amount of time, but a good enough amount of time. And what exactly does the Big Five contribute to our current understanding of personality? Well, essentially, it's the best we've got. It's not a perfect predictor, but it's a hell of a lot better than the Myers-Briggs personality types, which I did talk about before. I'm not going to go into those because there's a lot to cover in these five personality traits. But the Myers-Briggs it was good for the 1930s, from what I understood. I believe it was the 1930s, either 1920s, 1930s, whenever that was developed. It was good enough for that time. But now we have the big five personality traits, and these are a lot better. And they're not perfect, like I said, but they're good enough to where we can predict most of the things for the most part with human personality. And so I'm going to start off with neuroticism. So I'm just going to go through all five of the traits real quick first, just to summarize all of them. So we have neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, extraversion, and openness. And openness is related somewhat to intellect, but I'll get into that later on. So, neuroticism. Now, one thing that I never explained at all beforehand, which I did know, but it was a lot to go through, and so now I've taken more time to understand the concepts as fully as I possibly can. One thing that I did not go into before when I was talking about these is that each trait has a subtrait. They have subcategories. And so each trait has two subtraits. So neuroticism's two subtraits are volatility and withdrawal. Now, what exactly does that mean? All right. So, as I've said, each of the big five personality traits are rated from high in the trait, being high in that trait to being low. And so if you're high in neuroticism, you're also high in volatility and withdrawal, for the most part. Now, that's not 100% accurate because there are some exceptions depending on if you were to take the test and how you would answer how you would answer the questions. There is some differences depending on how you answer the questions to where you could actually be low in withdrawal and high in volatility and be high in neuroticism as well. So it's not exactly perfect, but I'm going to go with the best that I've got. So we're going to start off with volatility. So what exactly is volatility? Volatility is your ability, I suppose you could say, to experience emotions, and more specific, negative emotion. So if you're very high in narcissism, chances are you're very responsive and very receptive, very sensitive, I should say, to negative emotion. And so that includes anything from anger to sadness to depressive thoughts. Anything that is all negativity, that's exactly what neuroticism uncovers. And on top of that, there's also, I said neuroticism. I should have said narcissism. If you're high in narcissism, because I believe neuroticism is slightly different, and I'm not fully sure what the difference is between the two, but there is a slight difference. And I think neuroticism is specifically what's related precisely to negative emotion, while neuroticism encompasses a larger range of things, a larger range of categories that results in negative emotions in others as well, and in negative environments in general. That's what narcissism, I believe, is causing negative environments as a whole. And neuroticism is more specific about your emotion and your sensitivity to negative emotion. And so if you're high in neuroticism, and particularly high in neuroticism, then you're probably very high in volatility, which makes sense, because then you're essentially leaving yourself open. And this is a subconscious thing, you can't really control this, is that you're leaving yourself wide open to feeling these emotions a lot more stronger than some people might. And I believe it's really scattered on the average. There's no real average as to where people. It's not like most people are 10% in narcissism, or 90% of people are narcissistic. It's not like that at all. It's completely spread out across the board. And so that's really interesting. So what exactly does that look like? Well, it's like you always see the worst in everything. Let's go with that. It's like whenever you have, of course, for example, whenever you have that example of, is the glass half empty or half full, you'd have a glass that's about halfway. And you ask someone if it's half empty or half full. Well, the narcissists are generally going to say, not always, but generally what they will say, because they could be extroverted, and that's related with high in positive emotion, but generally what the narcissists will say is that the glass is half empty, because they're looking at the bad side of life. They're looking at the bad side, and you absolutely want to avoid those kind of people, and it's really hard to avoid those kinds of people, because so oftentimes you won't even notice that they're those types of people, because they often seem to cover it up with sarcasm or just pure jokes. And so they create a negative environment around them. And that, of course, even if you're joking about something negative, it still creates an overall negative effect. I think a great example of this would be comparing this to math, where if you add a positive and a negative together, you're always going to get a negative every time. The joke is the positive, but how would you say, the entire description of the joke, or the entire objective of the joke, is to be negative. And so no matter what, every time you're going to get a negative output of that. And so people who are high in narcissism, they may try and mask it with joking or with sarcasm, but it absolutely still causes negative emotion in the long run. So people who are low in neuroticism obviously tend to experience more positive emotion, although it's of course not guaranteed. Extraversion is a much better predictor of that. And so neuroticism's second subtrait, so the first subtrait was volatility, the second subtrait of narcissism is withdrawal. Now, this is pretty self-explanatory. Withdrawal. They don't want to go out and see the world. And now that's not exactly attached with openness, but it is partially. Withdrawal is more in the sense of they're going to avoid what they have to do. Let's say that. I think that's a better way of putting it. They're going to avoid what they know that they should be doing. They're withdrawing from it, of course. And I don't think I really have anything else to expand on that. Withdrawal is a pretty self-explanatory trait, if I'm not missing anything, and I don't believe I am. So what's the next trait? The next trait we'll go into is agreeableness. Now, agreeableness is linked with compassion and politeness. Of course, agreeable people don't want conflict, and their most important aspect of life is relationships. They love relationships, and that's how they orient their life for the most part. Because disagreeable people want competition, and they don't care so much about people's feelings. That's a strong one. They have less empathy. People who are disagreeable tend to have less empathy. And I know that because I used to be one of those people who were really unempathetic towards others because I was such a competitive person. I always thought to myself, okay, I want to win, and so I'm going to do whatever means necessary to win. And I don't care about how you feel after that. And of course that's a wrong way of thinking, because it doesn't matter what game it is, no matter what game or what achievement you're trying to get towards, is that if you're causing pain for others in the long run, it's not going to be good for you at all. And why is that? Well, it's because life isn't a game. Life is a series of games. And so when you act in a bad way to where people may not want to play with you in one game, then it could affect every other game in the future. And so if you act in a way where you're not empathetic towards other people's feelings one time, then it could just affect you for the rest of your life and continue this downward spiral. And that's partially where perhaps the catastrophe snowball effect comes into play. And I talked about that a little bit in my second video. And so agreeable people are attached with compassion and politeness. So those are pretty similar, I'd say, but they also have some differences. So compassion, well, what does that look like? That looks like if you're high in agreeableness, then you're probably high in compassion and politeness. So if you're high in compassion specifically, that basically looks like you care about the other person, and that's why agreeable people tend to be really good in relationships, or good enough in relationships. Let's say that, because disagreeable people can take advantage of agreeable people massively, and disagreeable people sometimes don't even realize that. But if they're narcissistic and disagreeable, they can easily take advantage of agreeable people and not care at all, even though they know they're doing it. That's a terrible, terrible outcome. So, agreeable people are compassionate, and so they care about others, and they also don't want conflict. They absolutely try and avoid conflict at all costs. So no matter what it takes, sometimes to the extreme of their own physical or mental well-being, they'll do whatever they need to do just to make sure no conflict happens whatsoever. That's really highly agreeable people. Now you could be somewhere in the middle where it's half and half. Sometimes you need to be disagreeable and say what's on your mind, and sometimes you just need to let things slide and not worry too much about it. And so I believe that's the perfect middle ground we'll go with. Is you're somewhat disagreeable and you know when to be disagreeable, but you're also agreeable and you know when to be agreeable, and you know when to be compassionate. And so agreeableness is also linked with politeness. Well, that's a pretty obvious one. Of course, they generally want what's best for others. Let's go with that. That's a good way of putting it. So you have an agreeable person, and they'll often put someone else's needs in front of their needs. Even if it caused them harm currently in the moment, they'll still put their own needs behind the person that they want to help. So that's really interesting to me. And so the next trait is conscientiousness. Now, what does conscientiousness looks like? Well, that's essentially the predictor of long-term success. Conscientiousness and openness, but conscientiousness specifically, because conscientiousness, there's two subtraits that are linked to it, and these are so critically important for long-term success. One of them is industriousness, the other one is orderliness. So what is industriousness? Industriousness, you've definitely seen people like this. They don't like to do nothing. If they're ever doing work, or there's ever nothing to do, they don't like that. They want to always be doing something. You sometimes see this, especially at workplaces, and I'm exactly like this. And I've had people who are most likely at least low in industriousness, to where they don't care if they're not doing anything, and they just waste time. I'm not like that at all. I can't be like that. It's a complete waste of time, and I don't see any value whatsoever. Sure, you don't need to do any work, but then what the hell are you doing? You're doing nothing, so you may as well do work. That's how I see it. And I've thought about it quite hard, and I don't see how that's necessarily an incorrect answer. You should want to strive to do as much as you can and to work as hard as you can, because you want to make yourself invaluable. You want to work so much, or work to a degree that's acceptable enough for you, and more than acceptable enough for everyone else around you, to where you are indispensable, and then they can't get rid of you. And that's of course in the beginning, and then later on you develop these traits even further, to the point that you're always figuring out the problems that other people can't solve. And so you're trying to understand what needs to be done. And if you're industrious, then it makes it 10 times easier, because then you want to get things done. You don't want to just sit around, and you actually find joy and excitement and interest in getting things done. And so that's industriousness, is that willingness to want to do something even when there's nothing to do. You're always looking for something. So you have to entertain your mind somehow and be productive. And so the other sub-trait of conscientiousness is orderliness. Now orderliness is pretty self-explanatory. It's mainly responsibility, and it's also mainly linked to organization. And so if you're high in conscientiousness, you're probably high in industriousness and high in orderliness. And so you can see how those would be predictors of long-term success. And that's why I was saying that the Big Five personality trait is definitely one of the best current models that we have of predicting success in general in life. Is because conscientiousness especially works so well. In agreeableness, there's so many ways that you can psychoanalyze a situation and see where an agreeable person works or doesn't work, and where disagreeable actually comes at a better advantage. Same with conscientiousness. There's a lot of places, especially of course in high school and university, where conscientious people, of course, do substantially better than anyone else. Because of course if they're industrious, then they want to get things done and they don't want to stay stagnant. And so of course you may see people who are not industrious, and those are the people generally who don't do their homework, who don't do the work that they're supposed to be doing, or put it off until the last minute, or completely don't do it at all. I've even seen that. I couldn't even believe how many times I saw that. People just didn't do the work because they just didn't care enough. And of course, the entire education system is so completely screwed that you can do basically nothing and you can still pass any course, or almost any course, not any course, but any of the mandatory courses you can definitely pass, because what are they going to do? They can't just keep you in high school forever. You need to move on. And so you could, to a certain degree, get away with not doing any of your homework or not doing some of the assignments and still graduate from high school. Now university is a different story, obviously, because now you're in a hyper-competitive environment. For the most part, not completely, but it's usually more competitive because you have to understand that there's other people that also want these positions, these jobs that you're working for, as well as you do. And so that's conscientiousness. That's a big predictor of success in mainly those categories, but also in long-term life success, because you have industriousness and you have orderliness. You're able to organize your schedule, your routine, your thoughts. So there you go. Now extraversion. Extraversion is the fourth trait that I want to talk about. Now, as I said, extraversion is linked with positive emotion. The more extroverted you are, the more sensitive to positive emotion you generally are, or the more positive in general you seem to be. And so, what are the two subcategories of extroversion? Well, one of them is enthusiasm, and the other one is assertiveness. Now, that makes a lot of sense, because people who are extroverted, and this is a very crucial thing that not a lot of people seem to understand, is that just because you're introverted doesn't mean that you're always shy. If you're introverted, it means that you lose energy in social situations. Now that's a big difference. This is how I've heard it said, and it's the best way I've ever heard it put, is that if you're extroverted, you start off with absolutely no energy at the beginning of the day, and the more social interactions you have throughout the day, you eventually have so much energy that you don't know what to do with it. Now introverts the exact opposite. We start off with a bunch of energy, and we go throughout the day as normal, having social interaction. By the end of the day, we have no energy, and we're done. And especially you see that if you have a friend that you may know. If you're extroverted and you have a friend that you think is introverted, well, if you ever go to a party with them, because introverts do like to go to parties, just we tend to usually be shy. Not all of us. There can be extroverts that are also shy, but generally it is linked with introversion. Now, if you have a friend who actually does like going to parties, but you may see them, they'll go to one party, and then 2 weeks you won't even hear from them because they're recovering. Because a party is a big thing to an introvert, because it's so much social energy, and we need time to regenerate that energy. Otherwise, we just don't know what the hell we're doing. It's too overwhelming for us. We need a break. We need to relax. Whereas an extroverted person, that's how they get more energy. They can't stand being alone. And by the way, about 60% of the world population is extroverted, about 40% is introverted. So that's an interesting stat, the fact that usually it seems to me, because positive emotion is linked with extroversion, it seems like 60% of the population, roughly speaking, it's not perfect, tends to have more positive emotion than negative. Now, introverts obviously can still have positive emotion, especially if they're low in neuroticism or narcissism. But if they're high in narcissism and they're low in extroversion, so they're introverted, then chances are they're going to have a really miserable life, and that's an absolute terrible path to go down. And so extroversion is linked with enthusiasm. We'll go with the subtrait of enthusiasm first. So of course enthusiasm is how would I say this? Is essentially charisma. Let's go with charisma. That's the word I'm thinking of. Enthusiasm is linked with charismatic people. If they're charismatic, they're probably extroverted because they're able to talk to people and they're able to do it naturally because it's their natural environment. That's such an important thing to understand. You gotta know what your personality traits are, because it will orient your life in such a good direction if you understand that, because then you know what you're looking for and what you need to avoid. Because there are certain things that you should be looking for, and without a doubt certain things you should be avoiding. If you are introverted and you are agreeable, let's go with that. Parties probably aren't a great idea for you, because you're going to have a lot of people who, especially if you're a male, trying to look for a woman, for a female, then at parties especially, you're going to see that there's a lot of disagreeable people who are going to be going for the women. And so, if you're agreeable and introverted, going to a party is probably one of the worst choices you can make. But of course, it's still fun if you're not. And of course, there's many exceptions. There's many different contexts to this. But the general reality is that's what you want. Is you want to orient your life in the way that your personality was laid out. And now your personality can change. It does adapt over time as you age. Now, extroversion does seem to be the one that changes the least. Absolutely the least. Now, introverted people can still train themselves to become extroverted, and extroverted can train themselves to become introverted. That's a fact, although it's very difficult. Now, the other ones tend to change over time. Like you could have an agreeable person, and generally naive agreeable person, who eventually becomes disagreeable because over time people have burned them. They've been lied to, and so they become disagreeable and trust no one, and that's where being cynical comes from. I won't go too far into that. And extroversion's second subtrait. So the first one was enthusiasm. Second one is assertiveness. Of course, if someone's charismatic, someone's enthusiastic, of course, if they're high in extroversion, then chances are they're going to be high in assertiveness also. They're going to tell you what's on their mind. So extroverted people tend to be lower in agreeableness, and introverted people tend to be higher in agreeableness. Of course, that makes sense. And so if they're assertive, then they're telling you what they want, and they're going to go for what they want, because that's the competitive aspect of being assertive. And if you're assertive, then you're probably disagreeable. And so that's why you could be extroverted and still agreeable, in which case your assertiveness is probably relatively low. So that's an interesting thing to think about. And now the final trait of the big five is going to be openness. Now, as I said, openness is linked with intellect. Well, the two sub-traits of openness is openness and intellect. Okay, what do I mean by openness? I mean more so in the sense of creativity. People who are high in openness tend to be much more creative than people who are low in openness. Not only that, people who are higher in openness also tend to be more intellectual. They like to discuss ideas. And so you see this very often, and this is, I can't believe I didn't know this about myself sooner. I only realized this very recently, is that I know I'm high in openness, but I couldn't figure out why, because I'm not a creative person by any means. And then I saw, okay, well, the intellect is there, or at least by my definition, I believe the intellect is there. But why am I so high in openness when the creativity, I know for a fact the creativity isn't there. I can think in words and I can think in pictures pretty equally. So I do have some creative aspect to me, but absolutely creative for the most part. I enjoy playing the piano, and so that is one creative aspect. But overall, I don't see myself as a creative person, so why? Why am I so high in openness? And here's the answer. Is because I like engaging in intellectual conversations. And one of the main characteristics of people who are high in openness is you'll know they're high in openness because they see other people as a gateway to an intellectual conversation. And so I know absolutely that's how I am. If I ever meet an interesting person, I want to talk to them. I want to talk to them about interesting and complicated ideas and to get their opinion. And so that's high in openness. And if you're low in openness, chances are you prefer routine. which can be good but also can be bad. And of course, if you like routine, then you're probably still intellectual. So you can be low in openness but still be high in intellect, and just low in creativity, which of course, that people who are generally stick to schedules and routines probably aren't all that creative. Now there's of course still some exceptions to that, but generally that's what openness is. And so that's all the five personality traits. And so now I just want to go through them real quick and tell each specific aspect or each specific environment that each of these traits thrive in. And so, well, narcissist, if you're high in narcissism, what do you thrive in? So if you're high in narcissism, what do you thrive in? Well, if you really think about it, what are narcissists? Well, they tend to be pretty responsive to negative emotion. So it's kind of difficult to pinpoint exactly what they thrive in, because narcissism isn't a good trait to have to begin with. Now I can tell you what people low in narcissism tend to thrive in, and it's with other people who aren't narcissistic. And so if you're low in narcissism, you want to stay away from people who are narcissistic, who have negative emotion, and that's a weird one, because it means that they're very sensitive to negative emotion. Doesn't mean they're necessarily a negative person, but they probably so if you're low in narcissism, I suppose what I would say is that you want to stay away from the people who generate negativity around them. That's your best bet. If you're high in narcissism, you want to stay around people who are able to tolerate your narcissism, but you want to work on that. You absolutely want to work on it. You don't want to stay in that area, because it's kind of hard to find a niche specific for that trait. And so now let's go. If you're agreeable, relationships, that's your niche. That's your category. If you're agreeable, absolutely relationships, and especially one of them I can really think of really easily is a therapist. If you're agreeable, chances are you'd be a great therapist, because you of course, you're probably high in compassion and in politeness. Whereas if you're disagreeable, competition, of course, that's the obvious one. If you're disagreeable, you want competition, you want to prove that you're the best. Of course, that's what competition is about. So if you're high in agreeableness, try and find something where it's all about relationships, it's all about working with others and being collaborative and being nice to each other. If you're disagreeable, go for something where you can really work hard to beat everybody else at. Because that's the point of a competition. I don't think there's anything wrong with that mindset. Like, that's what it is to be disagreeable, to be competitive. You want to beat everybody else. There's nothing wrong with that mindset. That's what a competition is for. And so, now conscientiousness. If you're high in conscientiousness, well, obviously university or high school, those are the two main ones. And anything that has intellectual fields and management positions, more specifically. Let's go with that. Because if you're, of course, conscientiousness is linked with industriousness and orderliness. So management positions need you to always be working all the time. And so you're going to love that. You're going to be, and especially if you're disagreeable, because then you're going to be in power. And I don't mean power in a bad way here. If you're responsible with your power, it can be a great and tremendous, how would I say that? It would be a tremendous benefit to you if you use your power correctly. Because then you can set the company up for complete success and set everyone up around you for complete success. But that's only if your orderliness is correctly oriented. Because you can have bad orientation with how you want to order the place and structure the place. And so then that just causes misery for everyone who works there. And if you're low in conscientiousness, then you want to go for something that doesn't require so much work, that's a lot more laid back. And I don't really know a specific example of this, but that's the general idea of it. And next personality trait, the niche for extraversion. Well, if you're extroverted, obviously your niche should be something that has to do with society, that's social, where you can talk to a lot of people. So being a presenter, being someone who going to events, especially, anything where customer service. If you're agreeable and you're extroverted, customer service is a perfect one for you. Absolutely perfect. And if you're introverted and agreeable, you can still do customer service and absolutely do just fine. But it's obviously not as great for you because there's so much social interaction. And by the way, I didn't mention this, if you're introverted, then introverts tend to do very fine in one-on-one situations. and they don't really lose any energy. And if anything, I know for a fact that I gain energy from intellectual one-on-one conversations. But if it's more than one person, generally I tend to lose energy. So if you're introverted, and it's how would you say? It's a lot of social interaction if you're introverted and you're doing some sort of customer service. But if you're introverted and you're doing therapy, then you're really working with only one person. You're trying to figure out their problems, so you probably want some openness and intellect in there, thrown in there. And so if you're introverted, so extroversion is social situations, well, what's introverted? Now, the best one that I've heard so far is probably nature. And it's kind of unclear, because introverted, you definitely want to be alone, but it's more specific than that. Specifically, introverts seem to go towards nature. And I know I definitely do that. And that just seems to be the niche that we fit under. Now, not all of us, of course, yet again, there's exceptions. But for the most part, that's the best predictor is if you're introverted, nature is going to be your best friend. Because of course you're alone most of the time in nature. You can go on walks, you can enjoy yourself, you can, especially if you're narcissistic and you have high negative emotion sensitivity, going on walks absolutely reduces that a ton. You can get more self-control, emotional control especially, and that's an important one. And now the last trait, openness. Well, if you're high in openness, obviously you either want a very intellectual field or a very creative field. And it depends on which one exactly you are. You know, as I said, I'm high in the openness subtrait and the intellect subtrait. So, but I can't see myself being an artist or doing anything super creative like that. Yet again, I can play the piano, but there's a limit to how creative I can get. I tried before to try and make a song myself, and I absolutely could not do it. That's just not the way I think. Now, if I'm trying to solve problems, that's where my intellect comes in, and that's where I thrive. That's why computer programming is such an ideal for me, because it involves the intellectual ideas that you need, the problem solving that you need, and also taking things from different angles, because that's what openness is essentially, is being open to new ideas, of course. And if you're low in openness, chances are you want to, how would I say this? Of course, routines, as I've said, routines are important if you're low in openness. And so you want something where it's very predictable. That's a good one. Where you know what you have to do every single day, and so it's the same thing every single day. So it's very boring. But if you're low in openness, that's exactly what you love, and so you need to keep that in mind. So that's the big 5 traits and all of their niches and everything I can really think of to talk about them. And there's probably a lot more. I could have gone way more in depth because there's so much to unpack with them. But that's the basics. So thank you for listening.